Hi, everybody that's joined. Good evening, and welcome to this little talk that we're going to have on Dr. Rahela Khorakiwala's book, From the Colonial to the Contemporary. Thank you to the lovely folks at Champaca for organizing this. I'm just going to introduce Champaca and Rahela and sort of lay out the format of our conversation before we kickstart things. So Champaca is an independent women-run bookstore, children's library, and cafe. They bring diverse stories and perspectives for their readers, and have a children's library and organize various books and events. They also have a small cafe for their community where you can spend a few quiet hours with a book and a lovely hearty meal. They're located in Bangalore. Shout out to my wife who actually introduced me to Champaca. They're right next to where I work, and I had no idea they're there. It's a lovely, lovely space, and they also have a great online store that ships all across India. About Dr. Rahela Khorakiwala, our guest of honor this evening, whose book we will be discussing. Rahela's a lawyer by training, having completed her law degree in India and having read for her LLM at New York University School of Law. She's worked as a legal consultant with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in New Delhi and the World Bank in Kabul. She has completed the integrated MPhil PhD from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, where she did an ethnographic study of the colonial courts of India, studying them as a legal anthropologist. She has 8 publications to her credit, including peer-reviewed contributions to the Indian Law Review and the Asian Journal of Law and Society. Her research has an extensive outreach as she has presented her work at several conferences around the world. After completing a postdoctoral fellowship at the Max Planck Institute in Frankfurt, Rahela has most recently published her first book, titled From the Colonial to the Contemporary: Images, Iconography, Memories and Performances of Law in India's High Courts. With that, I'll just give our listeners a little idea of how the conversations plan to go. So Rahela and I will be in conversation about the book for a good 35-40 minutes, post which you'll see a Q&A box in your Zoom app. So any questions that you have, we'll take it once the conversation's done. So please feel free to throw your questions in there. Okay, so Rahela, we must start at the beginning. How did this topic come about? Where did your interest in these high courts, where does the interest stem from?
Hi, everyone. And just before we get into the discussion, thank you, everyone, for logging in. And thanks, Radhika, Nirika, Team Champaca, for organizing this and putting it together. And thanks, Deepak, for that lovely introduction. Okay, so yes, right from the start, so more than, say, 7 or 8 years back, I always wanted to study at JNU. And I was in the interdisciplinary department of law and governance. And my supervisor was a sociologist. I am a lawyer. And it was a coming together of both of our work that kind of made me start looking at the court as a legal anthropologist, which is like a combination of law and sociology, not looking at it only as a lawyer. And in the beginning, I only looked at the Bombay High Court, which is my home court because I'm from Bombay. And I looked at it in different aspects. And then as I got more involved in the subject, I decided to look at the first 3 colonial courts because I saw a link between these 3 courts. So that's Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. And that's where I kind of brought my study to. And so over the years, then I expanded my research to Madras, Calcutta. And that's how this book now, though my supervisor still always complains that I don't look at she's like, you need to look at the court more as a sociologist and like less as a lawyer. But
So we were having a chat about the contents of the book and the difficulty in retrieving so much of this information, in accessing the archives and accessing the actual courts, which is a topic we'll come to. And I, of course, when we were exchanging notes, you told me of the immense personal difficulties that came while writing this book. But what were the challenges you faced academically while writing it? Could you just take us through the writing process itself? I'm guessing it took a while.
Yeah, it took really long, 6 years to kind of But I would break that answer up into two parts. So one is the actual writing, what you said, the academic writing. That is the second half of the writing of the thesis. The first is kind of formulating and doing the field work. So very briefly, like you mentioned, I guess I'd bring that in here itself. It was very difficult, even as a lawyer, to access court, access archival records. They're pretty badly maintained. So even the state PWD, when I used to go, you can find maybe something eventually, but it is so badly kept that you can possibly never read it. So much covered with dust. Like I had to wear gloves, mask still, and then you can't read anything because a lot of the paper is kind of shredding apart. It's not well kept. Like in fact, the state PWD, the room is not even air conditioned. So you can imagine the condition of the old like 1800 documents that I'm looking at. And in the National Archives, every document that I removed and looked at, it would say either too brittle, which means they can't give it to you because the paper is going to shred, or NT, which is non-traceable. So you keep like piles and piles of, you've applied for documents and they just can't find it. And in fact, when I went to the PWD, because I looked at the architecture of the buildings, they were most callous. They didn't care. They were like, oh, we've thrown away all the records. We don't care. So you're like, okay. And so it's like a dead end everywhere. So that's the archival part. But the actual writing, I think it requires some, I think for anybody who's writing a thesis or anybody writing anything, I think a lot of self-discipline, which you kind of develop over time. So even though I could have sat in Bombay and written my thesis, I made the conscious decision to move to the JNU library, literally. And I was there morning to night. I only left at night because it's unsafe beyond a point to travel in Delhi. So morning 8 o'clock to night 10, Monday to Sunday, it didn't matter what it was. And I just wrote, like even if it was writing one paragraph, one page, but it was much required. And it's not like a job where you can, I don't know, go and time yourself and be like, okay, I have to log in at 9 o'clock and leave at 5 o'clock. It's not that. Like the more time you spend, the more time this will take. There's no one in the end being like, okay, if you don't submit the book, it's on a thesis, it's on you. It's, not on anybody else. Like, so you might spend 6 years and then you might drop out of the program and it will end there. So I feel like you really need to like self-motivate yourself every day. You need to write that paragraph every day. And it takes time. You have to also be okay to rewrite. That's a big part about writing. Like write a chapter, rewrite it, rehash it, get it seen by people, edit it out, because after a point of time, you really can't see the flows, you can't see the mistakes. So that part is also very important. And I think that's the way I pull through it. I spent like a full complete year only writing the main core of my book. The rest I was writing, like as I would do field work, I would make my notes, because when you're in the field, you think you'll remember everything, but that's not how it is, because you're interviewing so many people, so many judges, lawyers, and the information might overlap when you're comparing. So I would interview somebody and immediately I would come outside and write it down and then go home and type it out. That really helped in articulating and keeping everything. So when I went back to my notes, they were complete sentences. The thoughts were complete. They were not like incomplete. So that part was also helpful in the writing process. And then in the end, of course, I mean, with my publisher, I had a really good editorial round. So that's not much in your control, but that was really helpful for me. She cleaned up the text a lot. And that last leg was very helpful also.
That's cool. The second part of your title is actually very interesting, right? Images, iconography, memories, and performances of law. So, and I've always wondered about this. What is a layperson thinking about when he looks at our courts? And your book really deals with that visual aspect of the judiciary and justice and accessibility. And I just actually wanted to read out a little excerpt from the book before I segue into my next question. In the construction of a courtroom, an elevated platform is a symbol of hierarchy. A partition between court actors signals inequality and a form of defined segregation. And a symbol of the state behind the judges signifies the authority of the state and or government through which the judge acts. Therefore, though courts are public structures, it is often felt that a court space is most restrictive to this very public. And you go on to also state that, courts of law are built in a didactic nature to impose and create a feeling of awe. So given this, why are the optics of justice and the judiciary important? How do we reconcile the objectives of accessibility and transparency to the public, and on the other hand, the awe and feeling of inaccessibility that these imperial structures create?
So, because these are, I mean, I'm going to answer the first part of this in a colonial context, because these are colonial courts. So, because, I mean, as most of you would be aware, when a place was colonized, the colony, to mark a stamp that we have arrived and to show their authority, they built large buildings and large constructions to show this. So the main, and they always picked up the main part. So it was administration and then the law. So they built these courts of law to show that they had arrived, and they were always buildings that made statements. And so the courts of law. So as you can see in all these three courts, they're very large, imposing buildings. And if you look at literature on the way courts are built over time, they always, in fact, the stone they use, the material they use is also very like bulky. It kind of all is imposing. The buildings are always built elevated from the street. So you're always looking up at the building. So you're looking at in awe at the building. Then you have long, narrow windows, but they're always closed. They're not accessible. So it's at one point kind of inviting. You'll have an open gate to enter, but you can't enter. So for example, in all these three courts, the main entrance of the court is inaccessible to the regular public or to the lawyers, even to the lawyers. It's for the judges. So, you know, it's open, you can see it, but you can't enter it. And then when you enter the court also, there's a process. You bow before the judge is sitting elevated. You have large portraits and frames on the walls, and they're all looking down at you. So this entire process creates an awe. So even when I interviewed people, a lot of people who were not acquainted with the court or law before, their first time in the court, they always felt a fear or an awe, like what is the structure? It's imposing in some way. So that comes from the colonial heritage, the building is structured such. What was the second part of your question?
The second part was just sort of inquiring into how one reconciles the objective of making courts accessible and transparent to the public, but also on the other hand, the edifice itself is, like you said, awe-inspiring and distant.
So I think over time that has not much changed. You'll see that continues. It continues in the Supreme Court of India, which is also a post-colonial construct. It's not, and that is also kind of inaccessible in the way it's structured. So that has not changed. And I think that is how courts of law are built. And that is how they are structured. And you'll see that across courts across the world. So
how important do you think it is for us as citizens, lay citizens, to be aware of the history of our courts, and in particular these three courts, given how they interweave with our story of independence?
I think I would keep that at a personal level if somebody was interested and would look in, but I feel like it would change your interaction of your workspace. Maybe as a lawyer or as a person who works in the court, it would, I think it would change the way you dealt with the court, or the way you behaved, the way you understood the court. So for example, in Calcutta, I found that the people were not very much interested in the history of the court. There was not much knowledge based on, in a comparison between Madras and Bombay. And in that court, like I had people telling me that, the court is so crowded that maybe we should not allow litigants in court, and that way we can create space. So, you really wonder that where is that coming from, right? Who is the audience of the court? Who is the court built for? If you are suggesting that litigants themselves should make way for place, then is the court built for the judges? Is it built for the lawyers? And I feel like that disconnect, I think it's important to kind of know. Also, you'll see the different ways in which the colonial traditions are so deeply embedded. And you'll see that differently in the courts. And I think that's also very much linked to your history. Like if you were to ask someone, should there be a dress code? The answer will be yes. But why is the dress code a band, a gown? Why is it black? Why is it white? Nobody knows. So maybe you should question, maybe if you do question the history, or maybe if you do try to find out why, maybe you change your opinion on whether the dress code is required or not at all.
So, I mean, personally, whenever I've been to any of these courts for a matter, I've always, I think one feels like they're a part of a larger, drop of history, especially in these three courts, because there's so much that's happened within those corridors, as we'll sort of take a look. We're coming to the Calcutta High Court to begin with. Why don't you tell us about the origins of the court? I mean, there's a fascinating tale that you describe between Calcutta, Belgium, and the First World War. Could you just sort of take us through that?
Yeah, so this is like one of the best finds of my fieldwork and something I completely chanced upon, like by sheer chance. And so basically, I'll pull up a picture of the Calcutta High Court, which is helpful. So this kind of helps to understand the story. So the picture on the left is an old picture of the Calcutta High Court. The reason why the color of the stone is so different is because in the 150 years celebration recently in Calcutta, they painted over the original Caen stone, which had come in from a town near Normandy in France. And so therefore the color is different, but it's actually, if you look at it, the same structure. Also now they have built two new adjacent court buildings in front of it. So now you cannot get that frontal view, which you can see in the old structure. So the story which Deepak is referring to is actually the building, the Calcutta High Court is modeled on the cloth hall of Ypres, which you can see on the left-hand side on the screen. And it's a model, and that's a fact. There's no dispute on that. This cloth hall of Ypres is a 13th century florid Gothic style building. In World War I, this building was completely bombed and completely demolished by the German bombing. You can see that on the right-hand side pictures. So the story goes in Calcutta, and every single person will tell you this story in Calcutta, like without a doubt, that when they had to rebuild this cloth hall in Ypres, they came to Calcutta to get the plans of the building so that they could rebuild the cloth hall in Ypres. Ypres is a town in Belgium. So this is just told to you, and it's mentioned all the time. There are speeches by the sheriff, the mayor of the town, which mention it. There are books that talk about it, and they talk about it with a lot of pride that, you know, the Belgians had to come back to India, to come back to Calcutta and get the plans of the court. And it's something that I myself did not really look into. But it just so happened that at a conference, I met the grandson of the person who was involved in the reconstruction of the cloth hall in Ypres. And he, as of mentioned, that I have never heard of this building in Calcutta. And it's very unlikely because my grandfather was so deeply involved in the reconstruction that I would have heard of it, but I'm not the right person. Let's ask my mother this. And I did actually travel to Ypres. I met his mother. I met the researchers at the cloth hall, which is now a museum. It presently looks like this. They reconstructed it, and they said that this is not possible because we've never heard of Calcutta. We never even knew there was a building in India that was modeled on our cloth hall. And so as you can see, when the building was getting bombed on the right-hand side, there's already scaffolding on the building. So the building was already due for some kind of renovation and restoration work. And so the architect had already made the plans, and he lived in a city outside Ypres. So when the bombing happened, he was able to, all the plans were secure. He was able to take them out and go to the other town. So the plans remained secure. And when they decided to reconstruct, the plans were already ready. They just had to use that. But it kind of, this entire story, and nobody in Calcutta has ever questioned the story. If you go to Calcutta even today, they will tell you the story that when the building was reconstructed in Ypres, they came to Calcutta to take the plans. And no one has questioned it. So what does that kind of tell us of how law, history, memory, how you reconstruct certain things, and also about colonial notions, you know, like of gifting back to the natives, you know, civilization, that whole idea of colonial, and how does this play out? How nobody in Calcutta thought it necessary or required to question this fact, this myth, this apocryphal myth. And in fact, the person in the museum, he plotted it in a different way. He was like, actually, the Calcutta High Court is the oldest building that stands now, even older than the building that it was modeled on. And that's an angle that is not explored, you know. So this is something that was very fascinating in Calcutta about the history of the court, that, you know, it speaks volumes about your colonial history and your relationship with it.
That's interesting. Also, something else that I wanted to chat to you about was the larger iconography of the High Court, right? Your book details the portraits of various English judges, Elijah, Imfe, and Struther, who presided over the court. But there's also the statue of Lady Justice draped in a sari. Is that an indication of the Calcutta High Court trying to blend the old with the new, the colonial history with a sense of Indian identity?
So, you know, about the statue in the center, so it's actually, I put this picture up because you can't see it, but it's on the right hand side of the lawn. That statue, it's a very small plaster of Paris statue. And I actually think that there was no thought behind having placed it in the court. So the original building of the court it has these 24 pillars in the front of the building. So these are a close-up of those two pillars, and you can see it. If you see on the left-hand side image on the top corner, you'll see a statue, an image of the Statue of Justice holding the sword and scales with the blindfold on the top. So, and on the right-hand side, you'll see the same image without the blindfold. So this is from the original, the 1872 construction of the court. The mention that you make of the Statue of Justice in a sari was added recently, and actually nobody knew when it was added, why it was added, and it's placed in a very it's just randomly placed in the middle of the garden. There, nobody kind of cares for it or accounts for it or even remembers it. Many people didn't even realize that it existed. So I wouldn't connect that statue to the history of the court as much as I would connect maybe these pillar statues to the history of the court. I think that is something that was just added probably at a time of some ceremony. They could not, nobody could trace it back as to when it was installed. Sorry, I think we lost you a bit, Deepak.
Sorry, my bad. Sorry, you will please carry on.
No, I was just saying that I think the plaster of Paris statue is not really connected to anything in the court. There's no memory of when it was installed, why it was installed, and neither is it kind of taken care of or anything. So
I just think it's really fascinating, the very deliberate attempt to drape this global image of justice with an Indian ornament.
But actually, if you see, I'll put up this picture from the Supreme Court of India. That's on your left-hand side. This is a mural in the Supreme Court of India. And you see the Statue of Justice, which is on the right-hand side of the panel. On the left, you have Mahatma Gandhi, then the chakra on the center, and the right. So you'll see her. She's also in kind of a sari, and she's holding the scales up in the right hand. And in the left hand, there's a book. There's no saying what book it is, but it's presumed that it's the Constitution of India. So if you see, this is the Statue of Justice in the Supreme Court of India. But when you'll still have, people still assume, and they'll still assume that the Statue of Justice is blindfolded, holding a sword. But if you look at this image, she's not blindfolded, and neither is she holding a sword. And actually the image on the right is, I make a reference in my book to this poster where they make a comment. The movie uses this title, Talwar, which is sword. And they make a comment saying that since the time of independence, rust has formed on the sword of the statue of the Lady of Justice, and that's why there's so much injustice in society. So where are you making this reference from? Because none of the courts in India have a Statue of Justice with a blindfold and in this formation. That's not the statue in the Supreme Court of India. Of course, that is a completely, media's interpretation of the court is something that's out of the purview of the book, but it's just something that I draw a parallel, and it's also something that you can connect to the Calcutta High Court statue.
And also, something that's quite interesting is the, unless I'm mistaken, the statue of Lady Justice in the Calcutta High Court has a blindfold, whereas in the Bombay High Court there is no blindfold.
So the Calcutta High Court has two images. One is with the blindfold and one is without the blindfold. And we come to the Bombay High Court where the statue is without the blindfold. So actually, this idea has changed over the years. So like up to the 15th century, the statue of justice was always open-eyed, was never blindfolded. The idea was that justice should see right from wrong and decide. But over time, the concept, the idea of justice itself changed. And with that change, kind of the blindfold became the master signifier of the statue of justice. And it became like the biggest attribute, the most important attribute, wherein the blindfold was required to keep away from bias.
Mm-hmm.
So as you see over time, the image of justice has changed. Of course, in the Bombay High Court, this is 1878 construction, but there was no records as to why this particular statue still is without the blindfold, even though it was in 1878.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I mean, Calcutta as a city is just, at least when I visited, always looks frozen in time. Such a remnant of everything that's gone by.
It is actually.
What about the High Court, though? I mean, your book talks about a lot of very unique practices, which can be traced only to the Calcutta High Court. No other High Court in the country, not the Supreme Court, have any of these practices. The flower garden show, the mourning bans, the resolutions. Perhaps you want to sort of tell us a little more about these.
Yeah, since I have a picture up on the screen of the flower show. So this happens in February every year. They use the central garden. So the Calcutta High Court is built as a rectangle in a rectangle. So they have this entire rectangular shaped garden in the center. So actually here, what the image you can see is only the left hand of the rectangle. Unfortunately, to accommodate an AC unit, the right hand side, if you can see the cement structure, that's the new AC unit constructed by the PWD right in the middle of the garden, and it's the height of 2 floors. So it covers, you can see two levels of arches of the Calcutta High Court. So that's something new that's been added. But I think something that the Calcutta High Court has a practice of a 10:30 and a 3:30. So what that is that if any advocate passes away at any given point of time, like in the day or whatever, any advocate who's registered, they, for mourning purposes or for like respect for the departed soul, they will either call a 10:30, which means that court will be shut for the rest of the day because the court starts at like 10:30, or they call a 3:30, which means that the court will shut for half the day. And this is announced on the morning when you're in court. So in the whole time that I did field work, every single week that I was there, at least one day went in this 10:30 or 3:30. And I would come to court and suddenly everybody would just leave the courtrooms and you have absolutely no idea why court is shut, what is happening, no idea. And then people will be like, oh, it's a 10:30, it's a 10:30. And in the beginning, I was no idea what this is because it doesn't happen in any other courts. And then you find out. But imagine what that would mean for a litigant who is traveling, because it's the highest court, it's the court of appeal for the whole state. So people are coming from the entire state, from interiors, you come for your matter, and you just, a 10:30 is called, and then there's just, it's a complete compromise on the process of justice. And, but it continues, and a lot of people, some people were against it, some people were in favor of it, but it continued happening, it doesn't stop. And once every week, so 1 week of work, 1 day of work every week was gone because of this practice. So that was something that I think that...
So if you're an outstation lawyer who's got a matter in the Calcutta High Court, you're best hoping that no one's died on that.
Yeah. And in fact, sometimes they would like time it. So if it was a long weekend or something, like if Friday was a holiday already, then they would like call a 10:30 on Thursday for like the week, or for the week, I don't know what they would call it for. And they had like one room and where they had a mic, and then they would just announce 10:30, and then no one had a choice, none of the judges, nothing, court had to shut. So
what's also interesting in your book, and of course we don't have time to get into it at the moment, but just for everyone listening out there, there is the slightest suggestion of some sort of unionization amongst lawyers who call for these resolutions. Typically it's those who don't have too many briefs, sort of, bandy about for these resolutions. But sort of moving on to the Bombay High Court, a couple of really fascinating tales there before we go on to Madras. And the Bombay High Court, there is that one excerpt from your book I have to read out. It caught my attention. Legend has it that there were ghosts who lived on these upper floors, and often when the court keeper went to leave the keys there, he was hit by an unknown force and thrown down the narrow spiral staircase. At least 3 different interviewees verified the story of different clerks, peons, and court personnel being slapped by a force while climbing up the stairs and being thrown down after dark or during the night. Sounds straight out of a horror movie. What are we talking about here? The fabled Sade Teen Mala, if you could.
Yeah, so back in the day, the court keeper used to live in the court. I mean, actually, the court keeper even currently lives in the court. But at that time, he lived on the top. Like, can you see where the roof is in the center, right next to that, at that level, like just below that? And so the Bombay High Court is 3 floors. So the Sade Teen Mala is the 3.5 floor. So so the ceilings are very high in these old buildings. So on the 3rd floor, they've created a kind of a half a floor on the top. And now at present, they have judges' chambers and they have some other offices and things like that over there. So in the earlier time, it was believed that the court keeper would lock the court and take the bunch of keys and go up to the 3.5 floor, the half floor created above the 3rd floor, kind of like. And in the night when it was like pitch dark, and then there were like these soft forces which would like throw the person down, and there are all such sorts of stories, because if you look at the building, it's a Gothic architecture, right? It's neo-Gothic, and it's built like supposedly on the basis of a castle along Rhine River. So it's, it has these like long passages when you go inside, and it can be quite spooky if the lights are off and at night. So I think those stories, like there are stories about the elevator shaft and all kinds of ghost stories. And in the Calcutta High Court, there are ghost stories in the criminal courtroom. Like everybody was like, oh, whenever you go to the criminal courtroom at night, you'll hear ghosts and you'll hear. So I think these are just stories that go around the court.
So just a reminder to everyone listening, we have a Q&A box down. In about 10 minutes time, we'll be opening this conversation up to all of you. So feel free to type in your questions. There are a couple of questions have already come in. So keep that going. Going back to the Bombay High Court, now the most famous or infamous event in the Bombay High Court happens in the central courtroom, which is the largest courtroom, typically occupied by the Chief Justice, but not anymore. And this all goes down to Tilak's trial for sedition. Tell us more about that.
So the image on the screen, the right-hand side is the central courtroom, and it's right obviously in the center of the court. So on top of it is the sunlight coming in from the top at the gable roof. And it is the largest courtroom. Tilak was a freedom fighter in the Indian freedom movement. He had 3 trials of sedition which happened in the Bombay High Court. Of context, in here is the second trial of 1908. It was heard in this very courtroom. Tilak was held guilty for sedition within a jury of 7:2, with basically all 7 were the white jury members and the 2 were the native Indian members. So, and the verdict was also 7:2. So basically the entire white jury voted against Tilak. And so he was imprisoned and he was fined 1,000 rupees. Tilak represented himself. So at the end of his, when he was given the verdict, he made this statement, which is on the left-hand side in spite of the verdict of the jury. This statement is on a marble plaque and it's placed outside at the entrance of the central courtroom. Now, the central courtroom was in the Bombay High Court, it's the largest courtroom, but it's not the Chief Justice's courtroom. And it's the central courtroom. At present, it is not being used. It remains empty and it's only used for certain events or any like exhibitions and things like that. And the reason is this connection to the Tilak trial. Like it's so strongly embedded in the memory of the court that that's some of the reason that they say that no Indian judge ever since Tilak's verdict has used the central courtroom for this reason, because of the injustice that was meted out to Tilak in this courtroom. And on one hand, there's a lot of positive space in the Bombay High Court, but the largest courtroom is kept empty. And also when I interviewed judges in the Bombay High Court, asking them why wouldn't you use the central courtroom? Most of them were actually answered saying it's a controversial question and we don't want to answer it. So, there is something going on about the use of the courtroom. While it isn't used for anything else, it is used on Tilak's death anniversary on the 1st of August every year. And the picture on the right is a rendition of that. And it's kind of the ceremony where the Chief Justice of the court, everybody removes their shoes, and in order of hierarchy, they come and they touch the base of the portrait, and in a sign of like touching the feet. And then there's agarbattis, and then there's flowers, and this entire ceremony is conducted on 1st August in the morning before court starts. And this portrait always hangs in the central courtroom. So they kind of take it down from the wall, they place it on this table, and they do this ceremony. But what is interesting is that this plaque on the left-hand side, it was placed in 1956. So it was placed post-independence. The case happened in 1908. And when it was placed, the then Chief Justice of the court, he made a statement saying that this is to remind us of the injustice that has tarnished the image of this court. And that's why we are placing this here as a memory of that. So the main debate on the main question here is, are courts of law places for political contestations of this nature? Like a plaque for Tilak, yes, that's required, but is the court of law a space to place this? Because the judgment or whatever, what was given then was in sync with the laws of the time. And now you're looking at it in a post-colonial context and you're making a speech and you're placing this plaque, and then the memory of that is so embedded in the people of the court that today you're not able to use the largest courtroom. So what does that say? Are courts of law spaces for these kind of commemorations? Are they not? Would it be the case that as cases happen, different judges will place different plaques across the courtroom based on what they believe are important political events, in the court? So that's the question mark about having this plaque outside the court.
Right. There seems to be a thread of commonality there, right? The administrative restraints that judges have and the deference to custom which needs to be provided, whether it's in Bombay or the 1030 resolutions again in Calcutta. But when even with that in mind, when we look at the context of the Madras High Court, to my mind, at least when I read the book, the Calcutta and Bombay High Courts seem more at ease with their colonial identities. And it seems as though the Madras High Court has been very eager to shed any semblance with that colonial past. In fact, the architecture of the three courts are different. I mean, Bombay and Calcutta having a Gothic style of architecture, Madras having an Indo-Sasanic style of architecture. But what are the iconographical indicators from the Madras High Court which tell us that perhaps it's more inclined to depict its own culture and instead of a colonial past?
So this kind of, you see it in the functioning of the courts. To just pick up one example to give it, so the three courts are located in the Calcutta High Court, Bombay High Court, Madras High Court are located in the three cities, Calcutta, Bombay and Madras. All the three cities, the governments have changed the names of the cities. So Calcutta is Kolkata, Bombay is Mumbai, and Madras is Chennai. This adaptation, so none of the courts have changed their name, right? They are still continuing to use their old names. This through the debate of this name change, that even the high courts should change their name, you'll see Madras High Court is the most amenable to it. They said, yes, we must become the Chennai High Court. Not only that, we should become the High Court of Tamil Nadu because we are the court for the state of Tamil Nadu. So in that you can see, there's also, I hope most of you might know, like there was a solicitors, the concept of solicitors in India. It still exists in Bombay. In Madras, that division is completely gone. They have kind of removed it. In Calcutta, even though statute has removed it, you can very much see the division. It's very much still existent, the division between solicitors and advocates, like, of the old time, even though that distinction doesn't exist. So you can see that difference in Madras often. A lot of people in Madras kind of at some level credited to the architecture of the court. They say that the Madras High Court was built in, like you mentioned, Indo-Sasanic, which is a mix of European and Indian architectural styles, and within Indian, more of Mughal and Rajput styles. So actually, I mean, I don't have a close-up picture, but if you see in the Madras High Court, the lower levels are Islamic arches, and then on the top, you will have Gothic arches. So it's a complete mix of European and this, and a lot of people also said that statues were not permitted in the Madras High Court because neither Hindus or Muslims at that time connected with the concept of statues. They felt it was Western. For Hindus, they only erected statues of God, and for Muslims, there was no statue of veneration, and so they were very much opposed. So if you see, it was not, you don't find any statue of justice or any kind of that kind of figure like you do in Bombay and Madras, in Calcutta. You don't find that in the Madras High Court. So I think those are some of the differences, just some.
And I mean, it's interesting that there seems to be a hint of cultural and religious influences seeping into the Madras High Court more than the other high courts. And the High Court, if I'm not mistaken, you said this out in your book, is also established on land where a temple used to be.
Yes, I mean, it's one of those stories that earlier there was a temple, conflicting stories. Some say that the temples of God were demolished to pave way for the temples of justice. But the other story is that the British had already decided to remove the temples to build something else. And then when they needed land for the Madras High Court, they decided that that was the land they were going to use. But there's, in fact, that because of the idea that the Madras High Court is built on the land of where the temples used to be, till a very long time, the prasad from the temple used to be brought, and the water from the Ganga river used to be brought to the temple, to the Madras High Court for people to take the oath. And then later when that shifted, they stopped bringing it. But for a long time, the prasads and everything from the temple were brought to court.
So another practice unique to the Madras High Court, which you set out, is that they actively engage with the public through, say, Doordarshan, right? And also there are some very interesting colonial practices there, legislative bills being sent and the bell being rung. Just take us through those.
Yeah, so they have some interesting things that are very specific to the Madras High Court. Like you mentioned, every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, they have a show on Doordarshan, which airs and discusses the most important judgments of the week from the Madras High Court. And I did not find that anywhere else. And I thought that is a lot of engagement with the public. And earlier, when there was not a clear division between the executive, legislature, and the judiciary, all the bills used to be, legislative bills from Parliament would be sent to the High Court, sent to the judiciary. Now there is a clear distinction, but the practice hasn't stopped. So even now they continue to send the legislative bills, and most of the people in the court registry have no idea what to do with it, why it comes. They say it comes every time, so we just file it. And it's a practice that continues and nobody is questioning it. And about the bell, so there's a bell placed like on the first floor in one part of the court, and it rings every time court is to start. It's for lunch break, when court is commencing, again in the evening. And earlier, when the court was completely open, when there was no air conditioning system, so all the doors used to be open and everything, windows were open, you could hear the bell across the court. But now, because of the air conditioning and everything, the doors are closed, and so you can't hear the bell anymore. But still the bell is rung continuously all the time. And it's like, it's hit 7 times, and it's like locked in the registry. Like in the morning they'll remove it, they'll ring, they'll lock it, they put it back. Like there's an entire staff just that takes care of this bell. And it's a practice that continues. You ask them, everybody's like, now everybody has watches. They don't even look, they don't look at the bell for the time, but still it's a practice that is continuing.
All right. So I'll probably just ask you one final question before we go to the question, since we're running short of time. There's a really apt quote in the book which talks about how these 3 high courts are in the shadows of an ever departing but never departed empire. And we've seen there's a thread of colonial commonality that's tied these 3 cities and courts together years after independence. So how much of the colonial do you see in the contemporary?
So I think the colonial practices are very embedded in these 3 courts. And in fact, if you were to go to the Karnataka High Court, or you were to go to Delhi or Supreme Court of India, which are all post-colonial constructs, you will categorically see the difference in these courts. and their behavior. One aspect is the obsession with the dress code. It's very deeply in the Bombay High Court, in the Calcutta High Court. They're very strict about it, and they won't let it go for anything. And I think that's part of this colonial hangover. And also, I mean, all our laws kind of got amalgamated, and we follow, like, for example, the Indian Penal Code, the Criminal Procedure Code, they're all British. Like even the wearing of the gown, the band, everything, these are all colonial traditions. And so I think the colonial is very much present. Another aspect is how you refer to the court, like you call the judges your lordship. Yeah. This also comes from the colonial practices. And even though there's a Bar Council notification saying that there is no need to use the word lordship anymore, it is rampantly used. In fact, it's used like a conjunction in most of these courts. Like instead of saying the word and, like they pause with the word lordship. So I think these are all aspects of, like in the Delhi High Court during summer, they have said that you don't need to wear the black gown because of the heat. The same, some of the people in Calcutta, Madras, they wanted the same thing because it's as hot over there, but it hasn't gone through. That is, you know, and I feel that's the big difference in these colonial courts. And yeah, and the whole argument that basically we are still like under the shadows of this colonial you know, regime that has come with us through the laws.
Right. I mean, if one actually goes to the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, I think even there they've shed the my lord, your lordships, and it's more sir, madam. And I suppose a lot many more judges now insist that transition happens to sir and madam, but more so in the post-colonial courts as opposed to these three courts. So let's open the floor to questions. There's already a bunch of questions that have come in, and anyone else who wants to ask questions, please do send it along in the Q&A box down there. So the first question I think pertains to the tale of the Calcutta High Court, and the question is, were you able to locate the origin of the story in Calcutta, or why they didn't question the myth that the reconstructed cloth hall was based on the Calcutta High Court? I think you sort of just addressed that while...
yeah, so I think nobody even bothered to try. It was a story told so many times, again and again repeated, that it became the truth. So even when I was in the court, I was told the story, I read about it, I did not even question it, because it was just something that it felt like it was just a story that about the court. It was literally by sheer chance. I was in a conference, I met somebody, he said he's from Ipoh, and because he said he's from Ipoh, and I mean, it's such a small town, and what are the odds of meeting somebody from Ipoh? And I was like, oh, you know what, we have this Calcutta High Court, and it was built on this cloth hall of Ipoh. And it just went from one to one, where he was like, no, that's not possible. So in fact, I found out this story after I finished my fieldwork in Calcutta. In fact, I had already submitted the final draft of my PhD thesis. But of course, when I came across this story, I changed that completely changed the part. So like even now, I feel like I need to go back to Calcutta and tell them that the story, you know, doesn't exist. I mean, that this is the truth. I don't think they know, they haven't questioned it. And that's what I argue in my book, that nobody has even felt the need to cross-check this story or to check anything about it, right? Like it's just been accepted. It's just something that's been retold so many times, it's become the truth.
Yeah. Right. Neha asked how one can purchase the book given the lockdown in the city. Well, Neha, you can place an order on champaca.in, that's champaca.in, and they will have it delivered.
I think it'll get delivered after the lockdown ends.
Yeah. So Dwayne Fernandez asks, how would you suggest that the perception of the physical court, conduct of the lawyers, and power of the state has changed in the present circumstances of hearings being conducted over video conferencing? That's an interesting question. What's your take on that?
Actually, it's a really good question, because I've been mapping the video conferencing, like the fact that courts have now gone virtual. And what is interesting is that people didn't know, should I wear the gown, should I wear the band? Then finally, the Supreme Court passed an order saying that it has come to our notice that coronavirus sticks to the gown. And so now you don't need to wear the gown anymore. And so that's been said. So now people, they kind of wear formal clothes, but they're not wearing the full uniform. And I myself am waiting to see that when court reopens, will they still give that much importance to the dress that they have now suddenly kind of for a bit let go. And in terms of accessibility, I actually thought that now that courts are online, more people would be able to access courts. But actually that is not the case, because they have a lot of, it's restricted. Only the person who has a matter in court can get the link, and only that person and up to 3 people can enter. So actually how you could go and stand in court and listen to a matter, that option is not available anymore. So I feel like the courts have actually become more inaccessible with this process. And a lot of the rules are being modified, but as I understand from lawyers talk and conversations and a lot of articles that I've been trying to keep up with, I think it's going to go back to the old colonial traditions once everything comes back to it.
So Tanya asks, when studying the architecture of these buildings, did you find that the architecture of the courts perpetuate colonial injustice or traumatization of vulnerable communities in India? In the United States, for instance, many courthouses require abusers and victims to be in the same hallway for hours before a hearing, which can lead to re-traumatizing victims. Did you find any of this in your study of court spaces in India?
I think it's part of the colonial structuring that I think if I look at it from a post-colonial lens, I think definitely there is injustice built into the entire system, into the entire functioning of the court. If you were to ask any regular litigant who came to the court, they cannot even navigate themselves through the court. There is, in fact, no place to sit. The toilets are completely inaccessible. Like you come, even when in Calcutta, for example, if you are not an advocate, you're not even allowed to carry your bag inside the courtroom, not even a pen or paper. So where do you keep your things? So if I keep it outside, surely it's going to get stolen. Like you're not even allowed to take your mobile phone in. So people are traveling from all over. They come, there's absolutely nothing available. They are in complete fear of the court. Like sometimes people would ask me, because I used to sit in the last row when I used to do my field work. People would ask me, can I drink water in the court? You know, basic things like that. And none of that is, no one is talking about that. No one is discussing that. And the entire ceremony of the court, where you bow before the judge and you look up and you use language and you use Latin phrases, which a person, most 90% of the people in India are not going to, more than 99% of the people in India are not going to understand. I think all these form parts of that injustice that is embedded, not only a physical, but in different various forms. So I definitely agree with that idea. And I think it's in the buildings.
That's, I mean, the point about not drinking water in the court hall is one I can relate to. I've been admonished many times in various court halls across the country about, you're before a judge, you shouldn't be drinking water.
In fact, once I was admonished I was holding a book in my hand, which was a non-law book. It was a book on some other topic, a book on history actually. And somebody was like, you can't sit in court with a book that's not about law. So where are these ideas coming from? They're not written down. There's no written rule or written book contempt saying that this is not allowed, but it's happening, right? So where are these ideas? Like people have these ideas about the court and they feel like they can correct you on that. So.
Right. So Jasneet lends an invitation to you to visit the Punjab and Haryana High Court and conduct a similar study. I'm sure you.
I haven't visited the court, but I do write about it in chapter 2, where I make a comparison in the visual field of law. Like I compare different courts from across the world. So I talk about the Supreme Court of India, which, by the way, if most of you might be interested, if you look at it on a Google map from an aerial view, it's designed as the scales of justice, with the central part as the central thing, and then the two administrative blocks are the two scales. So, and the central courtroom is where the Chief Justice of India sits. So it's supposed to be that they are balancing, justice on both the scales. So anyway, so I also look at the Punjab and Haryana High Court and its Corbusier's construction. It's fascinating. You guys must Google and look at it. But yeah, it's not, I just make a reference to it. But I hope I can come to.
So Ben's got a couple of questions on the American courthouses, and if you've come across any resources that conduct a similar analysis of courthouses in the US, and also sort of in a similar way into the question you previously answered, he wants to know if your view on whether courts should talk about past rulings and any injustices meted out by such rulings.
So in fact, the first work I read about iconography and looking at courts in an iconographic way was about the courts in the US. And there's a very, very in-depth study by two professors at Yale. And they've come out with a book which covers completely a lot of courts in the US. And I used that as a base to start from where I started comparing, to look at the ways in which I can compare courts in India. Of course, one thing in their book is they do cover a lot of Commonwealth, like a lot of colonial courts. They do South Africa, they do Australia, but they don't do India. They don't touch upon India at all. But interestingly, they have a lot of good discussions about different courts. And one that I can just remember offhand is a court in New Jersey in which they gave an artist, commissioned an artist to build a statue of justice. And the artist built a statue. And the judges objected, seeing it looks very communist, the statue, like, you know, and the question is like, and they objected to that. And they said, we can't have such a statue of justice. We want the traditional looking statue of justice, you know, with the blindfold and the sword and the scales. And so this statue was kept at the back and a new one was made. But what does it tell us about our courts, right? If the judges are so opposed to something that appears to be communist, which you can't really even define as in a statue, what does that even mean? What kind of justice are they, like, what kind of justice do they believe, and what are the ideals that they have inside the court? And there's another court in Mississippi that had also commissioned artwork for the court. And in the background, the artist had painted a scene with and it had black people in the background doing certain work. It was like a scene from a day in the city. And the judges objected and said that you need to lighten the color of the skin. So again, what kind of justice if you are going to object to those things which are part of your cities? And in New York, one of the courts in Manhattan had a statue of, it has a statue of 12 lawgivers on its seal, on the top roof. One of them is of Muhammad. So there were objections from the Indonesian and Egyptian consulates in the city saying that there is no figure of Muhammad. Like, where did you get this? And so how can you make this? And they also objected that you have made a figure of Muhammad based on your idea of what Islam is today. So you've made him with a turban and a kaftan and holding a sword, like you're trying to show that Muslims are like warrior-like or, you know, ready to fight. When if you read literature on Islam, there are descriptions of what the Prophet looked like, but you haven't looked at that. You've gone with your perception of what it is. That was one objection, but the other objection was mainly that we don't believe in idols and you can't put up a thing. So actually the court removed the statue of, there was some construction work going on and they were doing some work with the statues, and in that they kind of removed the statue of Muhammad.
A couple of interesting questions that have come in. Opposite questions drawn from the same theme. One is, could the colonial continuity in our courts be attributed to the fact that the top echelons of the bar continue to be drawn from the same sections of society as it was 100 years ago? And a contrasting question is, do you see colonial practices slowly losing significance and relevance with newer generations of lawyers coming in? Especially in the context of courts, we always hear about it being difficult for first generation lawyers.
So I think this is a big systemic problem, and this whole dynastical thing where, you know, the father, the child then becomes like, it goes into that way. And it's very apparent in the Calcutta High Court. You can see it, like they have the bar association room, which is open for everybody, but it isn't really open for everybody. It is kind of only those people who were solicitors or who were part of that club. And it's like an unsaid, so, you know, during the colonial time, Indian lawyers were not allowed to participate in the courts the same way the British lawyers were. So over time, so the Indian lawyers were called the vakils, they were the natives. And there was a big division. That division has kind of manifested itself in these colonial courts between the original side and the appellate side. And you can see that division till today, and it's very stark in the Calcutta High Court. Like it's, they will not cross over. You will not do matters of each other's type, and actually any lawyer is allowed to practice any kind of law in India, I mean anywhere. And it's very distinct. They have two completely separate bar association rooms. They will not mix, they will not mingle. In fact, they even wear a different type of the gown. So the black gown. So that's how much difference there is, even though they are all passed under the same exam, the same rules. There's no distinction in them as advocates, but the distinction is very stark. So that definitely is there, the colonial continuity of the difference between the native and the British lawyers. And
do you see it being diluted with new entrants to the bar?
I think it's going to still take some time. But I think in smaller courts, I think, or in courts that are outside the big presidency town courts, I think
that don't deal with serious issues of law.
Yeah, which I haven't studied, so I wouldn't be able to say, but I feel maybe there's a larger scope of less of this dynastical thing.
Right. So Meghna has a really pertinent question. She says, despite being a public space, the courts, like you say, are highly inaccessible to the public. In this context, can you share your efforts to make the Bombay High Court accessible through your walking tour?
So I have permission actually from the Chief Justice of the Bombay High Court to conduct like these informative tours based on my PhD work. So the thing is, the court is actually open to everybody, and you have to just do the basic security check, which we do at any hotel or any cinema, theater, the basic one. You just, go through. It's just that people don't know that. You feel and you think that the court is inaccessible, but actually the court is a public space. So in all the three courts, that is Madras, Calcutta and Bombay, you can just walk into the court. Only photography is completely banned. So you can take your mobile phone in, but you can't take a camera device in. And you can walk into any courtroom actually and listen to proceedings. It's just that we feel that the court is inaccessible because of the way it's structured. And I feel like because photography is banned, that's a big reason why people feel like they don't know anything about the court, because they've never seen images of it. They just don't know what it's like from inside, how it functions. And so you feel like, okay, I have no idea what I'm walking into. And I think that's a part of the problem. But actually the court is open to everybody, and you should go visit one time, anytime.
So we've got a couple of questions before we wrap this up. Meera asks if when we go back to the 1030, 330 resolution of the Calcutta High Court, is it the registry that decides on this? Do the judges have any say in it?
So the judges have no say. It's not the registry. It's a group of lawyers who meet in a particular room. There's a particular room where there's an entire mic setup system. They gather there in the morning at 10:25, and then they'll announce on that we are passing a 1030 resolution, and then everybody will say yes. They say, okay, on majority basis, and then the court is informed. So in fact, the Chief Justice at the time when I was there objected to this and said that this practice is not okay, because you come to court and then court is shut. But the Chief Justice, as some of you might know, is always not from the court. It's like the Chief Justice of all the high courts comes from another high court. It will not be a judge from the same high court. So in that case, it was a judge actually from the Karnataka High Court who had become the Chief Justice of the Calcutta High Court. So they are not acquainted with the practices, the internal practices of the court. So she was completely shunned out. They were like, you have no idea of the practices. Do not get involved in it because you are from outside. So the judges have absolutely no say in it. Absolutely not. But they have to shut court. They have no choice. They cannot.
So there's another layer. Beyond colonial and native, there's the parochial and native. Okay. Last question. Jennifer asked, what was your motivation to study this particular aspect of courts? What are your reflections on sociological implications of these long-standing traditions of the court today? And what causes some traditions to change?
So I think there's a deep link. Like I feel like I wish everybody kind of studied the sociological, anthropological aspect, because it would really help you to understand how people behave in court. Like what I looked at was how law behaved in court, like the social life of law. And I feel like if people studied that, it would help their understanding, kind of like a psychological understanding of what goes on. And maybe it would become easier to provide access to justice, is what I feel. I started looking at the courts generally in terms of iconography when I started reading about it. But as I visited more and more courts, I got deeply interested in it. And now it is not possible for me to visit any town or any place anywhere in the world without going and seeing the courthouse first. So it's become very much part of how I look at things. I look at the courthouse. So it's become somehow, it's taken over, and it's very, very important part of my life. And sorry, what was the third?
What causes traditions to change?
I think cause the tradition to change would be, I think, something major would have to happen.
Systemic overhaul?
Sorry?
A systematic overhaul?
Yeah, but I think I don't see that happening in these colonial courts very soon. Like, people are not willing to let go of a gown. So I feel like it's a long way, but I feel it's much required, and I feel it would improve access to justice in these colonial courts.
I don't know if I'm part of the problem or the solution, but you touched upon the waiver of a requirement to wear a jacket and a gown during virtual hearings. I, for one, insist on wearing them even during virtual hearings. So I just don't feel like I'm part of.
No, but actually you're part of the conversation which says that you just can't imagine yourself arguing before a judge without wearing the thing. In fact, one of the Supreme Court judges commented saying that it looks like you can't argue, like you're not able to argue unless you're in, standing before the court and standing and doing the theatrics. You're not able to like convey the point.
You'll be surprised at the number of lawyers who've remodeled their chambers to have, a dais which replicates a court model where they're able to stand and argue as opposed to sit. They feel uncomfortable sitting because it lowers the majesty of the court. So that's interesting. So I think that's a great note to end it on. Thanks a bunch to everyone who participated, who's joined us on this call and asked us questions. Thanks a ton, Rahela, for your time. And of course, thanks to the lovely folks at Champaca again for putting this together. Over to you, Nirika.
Thank you all so much. Book is available on our website and you can purchase there, and we will start shipping as soon as lockdown in Bangalore lifts. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And I hope that for everyone who buys the book, one day I can sign the copies we would have done in an actual book talk. So happy reading. I hope you like my book. Thank you. Thanks, Deepak. Thanks, everybody at Champaca. Bye. Bye.